Maximize cloud efficiency with Doit, the trusted partner in multi-cloud management for thousands of companies worldwide. Visit doit.com. That's DOIT.com. Do it, your cloud simplified.
Packet pushers.
Hey, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Packet Protector, the podcast at the intersection of networking and security. I'm Jennifer J.J. Manila here with Drew Conry Murray, as always, and we have a follow-up episode with a special guest where we took your questions, listeners, that you had for Stephen and brought them in. So I'm going to let Drew introduce Stephen, and then we're going to get into it.
We're happy to have back Stephen Orr. He is a distinguished solutions engineer at Cisco and in the security working group lead for the Wi-Fi Alliance. And now we're going to dive into some listener questions. So welcome back to part 2 of our conversation with Stephen Orr. The first episode, we did some Wi-Fi security vulnerabilities. Today, we're going to get into some user questions. Folks wrote in across different platforms. And if you want to reach out to us, you can just find us on packetpushers.net/community, where you can join our Slack and talk to us there, or hit us up at packetpushers.net/FU. The FU's for follow-up. We'll get your questions there too. But JJ, you did some digging and you pulled together some pretty good questions. So let's see if we can stump Stephen.
Yeah, there's definitely no stumping Stephen. I think this is a let's wind Stephen up moment. Definitely some of these. I could tell that a couple of these you guys have interacted with Stephen before and you know where the buttons are. So thanks to everybody that submitted questions. I think they're all in here. If I missed one, I'm sorry, but just hit me up and we'll get it answered in a different way. So the first question is the longest one. I'm going to just jump through that one first. And it has to do with multiple SSIDs. So I'm going to read the question as it's written from David. So thank you, David Allen, who's saying he's interested in recommendations around best practices regarding establishing multiple SSIDs versus segmenting connected devices by their role on a shared or reduced number of SSIDs, particularly as we move towards more secure connections like WPA3. So I'm going to end it there because I think you probably know where this is going. You know, we've been told for over a decade, reduce the number of SSIDs being broadcast, save the airtime, et cetera, collapse SSIDs. And Stephen, just for everybody's context here, when I wrote the book Wireless Security Architecture with Wiley, Stephen was so gracefully and gratefully my technical editor. And one of the things that came out of the book and that conversation was those recommendations are still valid, but we have other things to balance that with. So I'd love to hear your response to this question.
It's a really great question, and I wish I had a really easy answer. The hard part of this is it depends. I'll qualify that out with a couple things. One, it depends on your security profile. If security is of the utmost importance, right, and you have older devices that don't support new security, the goal would be to separate them, right? If we were talking about IPsec VPNs, I said I only have a device that only supports triple DES and I have a device that supports AES. We wouldn't necessarily terminate them into the same VLAN, right? We wouldn't necessarily put them into the same network. So there's one aspect of that to think about from a security posture perspective. And I would encourage that would be, if I'm putting you in separate SSIDs, I'm also putting probably into separate VLANs and segmenting you through the entire architecture. If my goal is to provide maximized interoperability where I have legacy devices or even their newer devices that may not support the standards, right? If they're not certified in industry, we've started to see some challenges with devices that don't necessarily like to see multiple AKMs. And when I say multiple AKMs, like transition mode. So you turn on WPA3 transition mode, I offer 2 AKMs in the beacon, and some devices just don't respond well. Like they won't attach to the network at all. And then we now get into a connectivity problem. So what's the answer? Is the answer, do I segment them out into 2 different SSIDs? Possible. It already exists. Or do I downgrade security to the lowest common denominator? So those are some of the things that we're working through now, specifically in the IoT space, right? So in IoT, not every device is a certified device and definitely going to handle transition mode capabilities where we're trying to do multiple things within a single SSID. So wish I had a really good answer, but these are some of the challenges that we're seeing. And it's not necessarily certified. It's trying to accommodate, who wants to buy something online to only be told, hey, I just put my light switch in and it won't work with my WPA3 transition mode SSID. You're not going to go through all the pain to go unplug that light switch and send it back. Right. So again, there's a balance, right? Enterprise, I would say enterprise is more easily and more likely because they have higher security, typically postures to do multiple SSIDs than say a home user who may not understand the complexity or the need.
So, speaking of IoT, let's jump down here to a question from Killian about IoT and DPP. Is there really interest as perceived from the industry? If so, by whom? Or protagonists in the standards in authentications like DPP in parallel to 802.1x based authentication for IoT? Are we going to see it take off?
That's a very nuanced question.
Okay, well, tell us what DPP is first.
Yeah, let's start there.
DPP is from a Wi-Fi Alliance perspective. This is an in-house developed program.
Okay.
So it's kind of like the internal name is DPP, the device provisioning protocol. If the external name to the Wi-Fi Alliance is Wi-Fi Easy Connect.
Okay.
So the genesis of Easy Connect and DPP, it came out of WPS, right? We all knew WPS was horribly broken. So there needed to be an answer for onboarding and provisioning. So the DPP, device provisioning protocol group, was created and subsequently released as Easy Connect. So that program exists. The vendor adoption, I'd actually have to go back and check to see what the vendor adoption is. I know certain vendors have actually provided, capabilities for it for IoT, and it's not necessarily just IoT devices. At the same time, CSA Matter is another working group that exists outside the Wi-Fi Alliance. And they've also, which I think is the kind of where this question was going, CSA Matter, which is also in the consumer home IoT space, is using 802.1x with Deep TLS as their authentication and onboarding mechanism, as well as some provisioning. So from a Wi-Fi Alliance perspective, there's multiple tools in the toolbox. What we're trying to do is be able to accommodate both as they move forward. And it really does depend on the device type you get. Like, again, you got to kind of look at the certification. If it supports DPP or Wi-Fi Easy Connect, awesome. You can go use Easy Connect. If it's a Matter endpoint device, we've got to make sure that those capabilities are used as well. I love .1x because it's easy and it's consistent, but that's a different discussion.
What is the use case for DPP?
Onboarding. If you're familiar with WPS, which was basically the onboarding mechanism, you push a button on your home router access point, you push the button on your other device, it'll automatically onboard it. There was a bunch of security flaws with that we chose. It was time.
You don't say.
It's time. We're going to move on and do something else, right? That's really what the genesis of DPP was to provide a updated mechanism for onboarding and provisioning for Wi-Fi devices.
That still provides some method of authentication that this device is what it says what it is and so on, and should have access to the network.
Correct. So basically it's authenticating the device to the network. And again, it might be headless. It's not going to be necessarily your phone that you're typing a user ID and password in.
Right. Yep.
So this is, I pulled my widget out of a box that just got shipped to me. How do I get this thing that doesn't have a keyboard online?
Okay. So lightweight and automated.
Right. So we've got two different organizations trying to achieve a common goal. And again, there's just multiple tools in the toolbox to get there.
I'm going to lump two questions together here.
Okay.
Steve Rodriguez on TKIP and WEP and transition mode, kind of two separate questions. But the first is, why is TKIP deprecated, but WEP is only obsolete or unsuitable? Isn't WEP less secure? And then his second part of this is, will transition mode ever go away?
Okay, so let's talk about deprecation first. I actually just had a conversation about terminology the other day. So from a certification perspective or a standard perspective, you can use terms like deprecate. However, vendors can still implement them, right? So we can come out and say TKIP is deprecated, right? And deprecated would be from a Wi-Fi Alliance perspective, and I'll kind of parse some terms. You can say, well, we're no longer going to test it. We're no longer going to certify it. We can't ban people from putting it in their code. But we're just going to say from an interop perspective, we're not going to do any testing. If there's anything wrong with it, we're not going to fix it. So that kind of terminology, like in .11, they've basically said, hey, WEP, it's not suitable to use any longer, I think is the terminology, right? So we're trying to work through that methodology in the Wi-Fi Alliance. Like, how do we take something like a security programmer and move it through what I would call like the life cycle management stage and get it to a point where say, you know what, if there's a vulnerability in WPA1, you're right, there is. We're just not going to fix it anymore, right? We're just not going to spend cycles on it because it's been so long and we've moved on and there's other alternatives.
But is there not opportunity to tell, especially from the certification standpoint, to tell people they can't use that anymore?
So this is the other great point for that question. So who do we tell TKIP is deprecated to? Do we send a bulletin to my mom? My mom's like, what's TKIP, right? Again, this is kind of the security crux of the problem. Not everybody's a cryptographer. Okay, so why shouldn't I use TKIP at home? Well, I'll tell you why, other than security. It's because it's going to limit you to 802.11n data rates, right? Never going to get past a certain amount of speed. So that's a natural why I need to get off this cryptographic protocol. Not every security mechanism now, like 10 years from now, if you tell me, hey, when are we going to deprecate SAE? Well, there's no hard and fast rule why we would necessarily get rid of it, right? It's not tied to a PHY, it's not tied to a data rate, it's not tied to anything specific, right? So there's no necessarily forcing function unless it was so badly broken that we just couldn't spend the time to fix it. So I think there's a end user facing narrative education that needs to happen. I'm not sure which organization does it. It's not necessarily the Wi-Fi Alliance doesn't necessarily target the consumer, the end user. They target more the network operator.
Yeah, but can't the Wi-Fi Alliance kind of specify through that conformance testing and say that you're not going to use these vulnerable protocols now that there's other stuff out there, or it has to be phased out by a certain date?
They can, but I'll give you an example. So with WPA3 transition mode, what was put in the testing was that you cannot have TKIP enabled on a WPA3 capable SSID, transition mode. So that's a check that gets done when you're being certified through the Wi-Fi Alliance. However, can I still take an access point today and spin up an SSID that enables TKIP? Absolutely, because it's not tested anymore.
Mm.
So there's nothing barring a vendor or even a station from associating to, let's call it a legacy security mode. You would have to go through, I mean, it wouldn't even be a test, right? It would be more of I'm going to go through your code and make sure you cannot configure an SSID with TKIP on it. What we can do moving forward is say, look, if you're going to spin up this new thing, you can't have this old thing associated, in the same SSID with it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
So it could still be in the vendor code, but
Correct.
as you're activating capabilities like WPA3 transition mode, I can't use TKIP if I'm using WPA3 transition mode, essentially, even though it might still be in the code.
So WPA3 transition mode is SAE plus PSK, but they both have to use AES as the cipher for pairwise and group cipher.
So TKIP was the option we had kind of for legacy support or backwards compatibility coming from some of the older technologies. And it doesn't even appear as TKIP in a lot of configurations. You might see it might just be a checkbox that says something like backwards compatible or
Or the infamous WPA2
yeah.
when you configure an SSID. Do you want me to answer when will transition mode go away?
I was gonna see if we were gonna be able to slip by that one, but I had a feeling he's been waiting. He's just been waiting for this one. Please, sir, by all means.
You and I have gone around with this one for a while. I'm not naive and I get the need. In my experience, nothing good has ever come out of developing transition modes. They serve a purpose, but for every purpose they serve, there's unintended consequences that end up happening with transition modes. When we're going through it now, as I think I shared with you before, WPA3 transition mode, right? So we're offering multiple AKMs at the same time on an SSID. Stations aren't understanding it and they're acting poorly, right? So then it's a connectivity issue, not necessarily a security issue. What do we do going from here? And then there's a whole bunch of things that have to happen behind the scenes. What do we do? Is transition mode bad? Do we get rid of transition mode? Or do we have to come up with some other capability? Do we spin up a second SSID for those devices, right? So I've always struggled with them. And if you're a security purist, it's like, hey, let's start new and keep moving forward and don't worry about the old broken stuff.
This is probably the only thing that Steven and I disagree on. And yet, I do agree when it comes to WPA3 on a passphrase based network, do not use transition mode, spin up a new network, have one on WPA3, have a different network on WPA2, don't use the same passphrase or passphrases. So I am on board with that. But I do think that transition modes have a place. And this is probably the one thing Steven's smarter than I am, so I have to kind of yield, but I'm sticking to my guns on this one.
Stick to your guns. I will say WPA3 enterprise transition mode. Most of enterprise capabilities occur above .11, right? Different EAP types, different authentication mechanisms, right? So what we did in WPA3 enterprise transition mode was it's all about protected management frames. One of the things when we developed, the WPA3 program is we wanted to proliferate the use of management frame protection, right? So we said, hey, WPA3 enterprise transition mode, PMF has to be set to capable. So if you negotiate PMF, you'll be considered a WPA3 enterprise station. If you don't negotiate PMF, you're still WPA2 enterprise. And then What is a WPA3 enterprise only station? PMF is set to required. So that's kind of the delineation that we made there, which was a lot smoother than, well, in personal transition mode, we actually have two separate AKMs. Now, the challenge, and again, this goes to my passphrase based soapbox, all my benefits of WPA3 are taken back in transition mode because I can hack the password on the WPA2 side. I may not be able to decode over the air a WPA3 station, but I now have access to the infrastructure. And for me, if I were an attacker, access to the infrastructure is 1,000 times more valuable than necessarily decoding over the air packets.
Yep.
So transition mode, no time soon. Sorry, it's not going away.
Let's take a quick sponsor break. Maximize cloud efficiency with Doit, the trusted partner in multi-cloud management for thousands of companies worldwide. Doit's innovative tools, expert insights, and smart technology make optimization simple. Elevate your cloud strategy and simplify your cloud spend. Visit doit.com. That's DOIT.com. Doit, your cloud simplified. And now back to the show.
Carrying the theme of passphrases, I love this question from Daryl, which is MPSK or PPSK is a standard. So this is multiple pre-shared key, or it's also called personal pre-shared key, where an SSID is configured where, different passphrases can be used. And his question is, I would like to know why multiple PSKs is not part of the IEEE standard. Ruckus has dynamic PSKs and other vendors have implemented other one-off solutions. It seems as an industry that has huge value add. Was it a security concern that was left out of the standard with SAE?
Yes. Just kidding. So if we think about what personal PSKs or MPSK or however we want to define it, how does that work? Really, the way it works is it's a hack, right? I'm hacking the authentication capability of the four-way handshake and basically doing a dictionary attack on the exchange. That's how I'm able to provide these personal PSKs. That's also why it's not in .11. It's not part of PSK association. We're leveraging a vulnerability within the protocol to bring you this other capability. So why doesn't it exist in WPA3 SAE as written today in the Wi-Fi Alliance? We didn't design it around it, right? One, it wasn't a massive use case at the time. Now, if you think about it, as I said earlier, the journey for WPA3 personal started probably 9 years ago, if not longer.
Wow.
So these weren't necessarily prolific use cases at the time. They've grown to be these new use cases. So what I'll share with you is there's a lot of work going on right now being driven by the IoT industry on bringing this functionality into WPA3 or into security, into mainstream. So, and this goes back to the debate we just had or the discussion on, is it .1x? Is it, some other mechanism that may exist? There's things going on in IEEE. There's things going on right now in the Wi-Fi Alliance to try to address these actual use cases. So the reason why it's not part of the standard, it's because it's leveraging current PSK, it's leveraging vulnerabilities, and we're just not going to continue that forward. We're going to try to solve it other ways.
So I want to double click on that a little bit, simply because one of the things I think is really awesome from a security standpoint is that a lot of the different vendor implementations, well, most of them, I'm going to talk about a WPA2 network for a second, but they have an option that basically says you can use multiple pre-shared keys, and then you can just very easy check a box that says micro segment based on that. And so from an implementation standpoint, where we're trying to make things easier, the nice part is that, if I'm thinking about this as a security architect, that little button lets me skip or eliminate 3 to 5 other manual steps that have a lot of room for error.
Mhm.
If I'm manually okay, maybe otherwise I would have to do peer isolation, but then go put policies in place to allow certain things to talk to each other. And in the world of everybody's Apple things, or error this and error that, and Windows stuff that uses Bonjour and screencasting, that is really unmanageable even in a small network. So I kind of feel like personally as an architect, if we have something like this moving forward that's done in a secure way, that is awesome, because that little checkbox in any of the vendor's products
Mhm.
saves so many other steps. And I'm just guessing, I know SAE is fundamentally different than the PSK function. So this is what I want to double click in. I'm guessing there just has to be a way to allow multiple passphrases on a WPA3 personal network, and for there to be some type of indexing of those passphrases and a way to do something similar. Like there's an ID attached to that passphrase somewhere behind under the hood, right?
Yeah, so there's a bunch of different ways to solve this. And look, I'll share with you one of the things that I think that we need as an industry to kind of rethink about. This is just a little tangential for a second. Is this connotation of personal versus enterprise? I think post-COVID, those lines have completely blurred, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I think if you look at multi-dwelling units and you look at university dorms, right? We don't really have a clean separation between what's home and what's enterprise anymore. So what I would say is, yes, there's some things that are going on that we're trying to work on to address that. Now, what I'll say is like this micro segmentation tick box. I think you've got your MPSK, personal PSK thing going on, and then that tick box does some other things that may or may not be .11 behind the scenes, right? So one of the things, again, Wi-Fi Alliance perspective, or even .11, is there's a really thick dividing line between what's in scope, what's out of scope. Like doing peer-to-peer blocking, absolutely, it's within scope of Wi-Fi Alliance. However, mapping to VLANs, mapping to other things that may happen when you click on microsegmentation or something in the back end, those are typically a little bit in more of a gray area. One of the things, though, to bring up, like, so I've seen even with personal PSKs, everybody focuses on the PSK, nobody focuses on the GTKs. So
Mm.
I've seen this where, yeah, great. All of our unicast traffic is separate and segmented based on our personal PSK. We're all still sharing the same GTK for multicast. So as you mentioned, things like Bonjour or MDNS, I'm still seeing it from everybody that's on the network. So we really need a kind of a holistic solution around, all right, what does it mean to really provide this segmentation? Are we segmenting both unicast and multicast traffic? Is it just unicast traffic and we stop all multicast traffic? What's the right mix? And then this tick box, what does it do, right? Is it we want to require peer-to-peer blocking, and then we've got to take a next step on, okay, well, how do we connect those things that should be able to connect it? Like if I have my phone and a tablet or my phone and the TV, how do I designate that those two things are allowed to be able to share information to connect and stream video or stream things to each other? So it can get kind of complicated, but we're definitely trying to address the use case now. We've actually just kicked off a project that we're trying to address it.
Okay. I think that's music to everybody's ears.
Stay tuned. We're collecting the use cases now. If you have use cases, feel free to send them to me or send them to the team here. And you guys know how to get in touch with me. We can try to bring them in as input.
Another listener question, this from Brian Ward. Hey, Brian. Why is there no requirement that devices doing a WPA 2/3 enterprise support certain authentication types at a minimum, i.e. EAP TLS?
That's actually a great question. So there's not necessarily a mandated EAP type. There's a tested EAP type. So EAP TLS is usually the bare minimum EAP method that's tested. I think we do TLS, TTLS, maybe EAP, and that's it for right now. So the vendor can choose which one to use. The EAP methods are technically a layer above where we are, where .11 is in the Wi-Fi Alliance. But from what we've seen, right, like the TLS 1.3 part and then doing server cert validation, we are clearly targeting the TLS side mutual authentication piece for being able to do authentication on Wi-Fi. So we've tossed it around, should everybody have to do a specific EAP type? And we tend to try to keep it flexible, right? Where depending upon the device or device manufacturer at the time, if you think about where we came from, not every vendor, not every IoT vendor or small device vendor had an easy way to onboard a cert or had the ability to do .1x. But things have changed over the last 2 years. Now that we've seen with Matter and other devices, I would say here's the other piece to this. Not only should we look at EAP-TLS, but WPA Enterprise is not even a required certification. It's an optional certification. The only mandatory certification to get through for the Wi-Fi Alliance for security is WPA3 personal. So as we see more IoT devices doing EAP-TLS and, like I said, organizations like Matter, we really should start trying to focus on maybe enterprise is also a critical thing that devices should have to support.
Okay, so I guess the answer is then there's no minimum, authentication type because you have to account for a variety of vendors and devices with different device profiles. And Brian works in an environment where he's probably dealing with more enterprise type stuff. So
they have to support at least one.
Okay.
And it's not MD5.
Okay, so there is a floor. There is a floor.
There is a floor.
Okay.
It's typically a TLS-based EAP type.
Okay.
What about OWE? Will OWE become a requirement for future certifications?
And what is OWE for those of us who don't know?
So there is no such certification as OWE, but it's an RFC for the IETF called opportunistic wireless encryption. So we did this when WPA3 was released as a attempt to eliminate open networks, right? Open networks, absolutely, the whole passive eavesdropping piece. So it is an optional requirement. It's called enhanced open, right? And the reason why it's called enhanced open, right, is it provides encryption, not necessarily authentication. So
Okay.
that's why it's called enhanced open. Actually, it is a requirement in 6 gigahertz. You cannot have an open network in 6 gigahertz. And I have to double check, but I believe in Wi-Fi 7, operating in Wi-Fi 7 with either, enhance the EHT data rates or multi-link, OWE/enhanced open must be used as opposed to an open network. So what we're trying to do is increasingly push so that we can make it mandatory, right? So we're doing it via data rates, via the MAC5 programs right now. And hopefully in a few years, we'll see OWE proliferate, enhanced open proliferate, and then open networks be a thing of the past. And please don't ask me about OWE transition mode.
It's just about. Whoa, he nipped that one in the bud.
You
All
saw it
right.
coming.
So I felt it coming. So, and this will be my swan song on transition mode. OWE transition mode spins up 2 SSIDs. One is open, one is OWE.
Yeah.
It was the right thing to do.
But the open one is normal with kind of a redirect in one of the beacons that tells the endpoint, if it can do it, to go to the hidden OWE network.
Correct.
And then what I've seen so far is like different vendors do this differently on the back end. Some of them auto magically spin up 2 for you. Some of them walk you through spinning up 2 separate ones. Sometimes they are the same SSID being broadcast. Sometimes they're different and it automatically prefixes for you. I'm curious from a interoperability standpoint, because my, limited experience with this has been endpoints barf all over the place with just not liking that. So some of them didn't support OWE.
Did you say clients don't like transition modes?
I didn't say that.
Sorry, it sounded like client barf on transition modes.
Clients don't always like going to a regular network and being redirected and magically put on a hidden OWE network, sometimes with the same SSID name, which I think spazzes some of them out. I'm just curious, like from an interoperability standpoint, is the Wi-Fi Alliance testing for either conformance or interop for this?
We do. They do.
Okay.
So there's a couple reasons why that happened. The downside was with an OWE enhanced open network, we saw a lot of legacy clients get confused. Instead of just not associating to the network, some would pop up with a passphrase box. Some would pop up with a username and password box.
Wow.
Clients would react differently when they saw OWE because it was technically an open network with an RSN and they just didn't know what to do with it. So the reason why we did transition mode, where you have this open network with an OWE transition mode field in it, was to provide basically the BSS of the enhanced open network, so that the OWE network wasn't advertised, so that clients would barf on it. And I would say your mileage varies. I haven't seen transition mode deployed ubiquitously. I've seen some OWE deployments, some enhanced open deployments, but it's an education thing. We've got to get enough Wi-Fi devices, Wi-Fi 6 and up devices, where we know they can handle it, out into the field. If you're telling me you're showing up with a device from 2003 and expect it to work, open networks are you have so many more things to worry about than being on an open network with your 2003 TLS 1.0 device. Please do not do banking on a 2003 device.
True. All right. The last couple here. This one's on Apple and the 802.11 BI standard. So how does the announcement from Apple regarding rotating OTA MAC addresses help to address security concerns? Is this a standard actively being worked on? Another question's from Steve, and I had to kind of go back to him and get some clarity about what this was, because I'm not familiar with Apple. So I know MAC randomization is part of this, right?
Yes.
Okay.
So there's a couple working groups in 802.11 right now. One is BH, which is dealing with the randomized MAC addresses. And then there's BI, which deals with privacy issues. So randomized MAC addresses are a thing. They've been a thing for a while. And then actually, we've had some RCM testing in the Wi-Fi Alliance. It's an optional test.
What's RCM?
Random and changing MAC addresses.
Ah, okay.
So BH, they started with use cases and they're formalizing more concrete rules and other things that are going on. BI is really looking at privacy and how not to expose additional information from an endpoint. So beyond the MAC address, which was universally identifiable, what other parts of an 802.11 frame, beacon, transmissions can be used to provide some identification for the station from a passive observer? So there's a lot of work being done in BI. BH is well down the path of getting ready to publish their solution. Should be their amendment should hopefully be by next year. BI is a little bit further out because they're scrutinizing more into what could be exposed and how do we deal with maybe the frequency in which we change MAC addresses. Like BH deals with changing MAC addresses. BI is like, okay, well, how often should I change them, or when should I change them, or what triggers a change? And there, again, there's a whole slew of other things that they're trying to protect from exposing identity.
So the idea is we want to keep the actual MAC address hidden. So we're using this is sort of like a NAT gateway idea for MAC addresses.
Right now with BH, and what happens now is, let's say if you're probing for a network, you can randomize your MAC address on each probe request. But let's say when you associate and then authenticate to the network, you can have a randomized MAC address, but you're going to have that MAC address for the length of your session.
Okay.
So there's some identity in there. You're going to be able to be identified by the network at a passive observer for X long that you're on there. What BI is trying to do is minimize that exposure to, okay, well, I can see the MAC address, but I need to make sure that I can't do any long-term identification of that device. So hopefully that helps. And from a privacy perspective, it makes sense. Again, this is privacy versus security versus, even things like telemetry. Like a lot of challenges that we have in the Wi-Fi world are pre-association. So we've also got to take some pre-association. Like if I'm constantly changing MAC addresses and doing other things, how do we make sure that I can still troubleshoot?
Right.
So there's nuances in there that are going on as well.
Yeah.
I'm not getting on the soapbox today. I'm going to save everybody from my rants for another day. Let's wrap it up with this last question, which is about Passpoint. And Killian wants to know, where do you see the future of Passpoint going with respect to BYOD and IDP bound profile management? For example, MDM without owning the device.
Awesome question. Huge fan of Passpoint because the fundamental underpinning is .1x. Again, my soapbox will be done. But no, I actually see Passpoint being adopted more and more. So EduRoam uses a variant of Passpoint. The Wireless Broadband Association, they're using open roaming, which again is another variant of Passpoint, which by the way requires RADSEC. Just saying, little RADSEC plug there. So there is movement toward that. And as IoT devices are putting certificates on them, and BYOD can enroll certificates on them through an MDM, and it makes .1x that much easier, which allows me to be able to, enroll them in Passpoint or open roaming and get them on the network. And depending upon what's in the certificate, I can easily do my microsegmentation. We'll call it from there, right? So based on what's in the cert, we can do different things based on the identity once we have that. Redirect, put it in a different VLAN, put it in a different segment, or make it a guest user. So there's a lot of flexibility that we can do with open roaming with Passpoint as a foundation. I'm actually starting to see a lot of customers outside of education starting to turn it on in their organizations.
Very nice. I think that wraps up all these questions. And I know there's going to be more after people listen to this. So we may have to be circling back on another later date.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Stephen, for spending 2 episodes with us. We really appreciate it. And it was some great conversation. We got very nerdy. And also thanks to you, the listener, for your time and attention. If you've got comments, corrections, or clarifications, you can contact us at packetpushers.net/FU. The FU is for follow-up. You can also find us on the Packet Pushers Slack, along with thousands of other IT networking and security professionals who are sharing tips, swapping advice, and generally having a good time. That's packetpushers.net/community if you want to check it out and join. As always, thanks for listening.